Smash!
Hey, today we're doing a video on the topic of airbrushing, and as I record this, I realize this probably won't fly super well with my audience considering half of you don't own an airbrush. But that's kind of the point of this video. My goal with this video is to at least convince you to give airbrushing a second look. And no, I'm not gonna go into detail about all the crazy stuff you can pull off with an airbrush. I am coming at it from the common man's perspective of why I like an airbrush: convenience. Now, I do want to be crystal clear. This video is sponsored by Galerie, and they did offer me one of their new airbrushes, this being the Mobius 0.3. They did offer me an affiliate link, and it is in the description along with the discount code MISHMASH. You can save 10% on your purchase. But I want you to understand, I am not going to go about this video as a commercial. Towards the end of the video, I will give a little review and overall look at the airbrush, but ultimately the point of this video is I genuinely believe that airbrushing is a great tool to have as a hobbyist. But before we get into all that, make sure you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share with a friend. If you really dig it, consider becoming a channel member. You guys are what keep the channel running, and I couldn't appreciate you more. Speedrunning the promotional stuff, if you want to use my affiliate link code to More Games Atlantic to get yourself some cores, you can use my discount code MISHMASH5% to save 5% on your purchase. Okay, enough yapping, let's get to the actual point. We don't need to kid ourselves, airbrushing is definitely a contentious topic when it comes to online spaces especially. There's a little bit of a preconceived notion that airbrushing is for the fancier hobbyists, and if you don't own an airbrush, you're just poor. Well, that does certainly happen sometimes, I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't. But for the most part, from what you guys have told me, the biggest reason why you don't have an airbrush is you just don't have the space. Just kind of throws a monkey wrench into my whole thing of convincing you. I don't know how to fix that, unless you want to conquer your neighbors. Use your next door neighbor's house as an airbrushing booth. But jokes aside, I get it. There's plenty of other reasons too. It can be expensive in a hobby that's already pretty damn expensive, especially if you're going for Warhammer. And I won't lie, maintaining an airbrush is not exactly the most enthralling part of owning one. I'm an ADHD gibbon, so I just want to paint my models. But it's like owning any other tool. And that's kind of how I see my airbrush, a tool. And I think that's where a lot of the distaste comes from. Plenty of people don't own airbrushes, and when you see a tutorial on how to paint something, and a lot of it comes from airbrushing, it can be a little off-putting. Realistically, you're probably not going to be able to recreate the exact design and look of what an airbrush can create with your regular brushes. And even though I've owned an airbrush almost as long as I've been in the hobby, I don't exactly paint miniatures from end to end using my airbrush. The reason I like having one is for very specific but overall rudimentary reasons. Not having to rely on expensive rattle cans that I can only use at certain times of the year is pretty liberating. And considering how expensive the best primers are, this is already something that pays for itself. But don't get me wrong, I understand the appeal of using rattle cans too. It's part of the routine that people like. Just like how I kind of enjoy the routine of using the airbrush. Above everything, one thing that I like about having an airbrush too is it really trivializes base coating. Especially being able to zenithal prime things and just simply spray over using whatever color I like. Basically giving me a head start to a model and giving it a great look right out of the gates. That's a pretty nice thing to have, especially if you have a lot of models to paint. And as somebody that paints every single week, I don't know what I would do without my airbrush. And again, I'm not doing anything super fancy. The biggest thing that I like about having an airbrush is convenience. Plus, I will admit, applying contrast colors through an airbrush, oh my god, it's satisfying. Of course, some may argue that it doesn't require as much skill, but like I always say, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. I think the connotation of calling airbrushing cheap is something that I think a lot of people maybe take a little too seriously. And I get it, it's your art, it's what you want to make out of it, and I can understand wanting to do something completely yourself. But I'm having fun with this. Another huge positive of having an airbrush is something that I don't really do all too often, but it came in handy earlier this year. This is army building. I ended up having to build a Gloomspite Gitz army for Adepticon earlier this year, and I only really had a few weeks to get it built and painted on top of the other projects that I had going on for the channel. The airbrush was an MVP of this project, as it allowed me to base and prime just about everything really quickly, and I utilized it to paint my dank old Trogoth in a pretty simplistic but effective method. It's a little obvious that I airbrushed him, but when it's on the tabletop, I don't think it matters too much. I think he looks cute. And sure, I've had plenty of experience using my airbrush before, and it probably did help with this project, I'm not discounting that. But considering I haven't built and painted an army since the 2017 Death Guard releases, this goes to show just how nice it is to have a tool that can really speed along the process. But now that I've given you a little listing of all the positives of owning an airbrush and what it can do for you as a hobbyist, I do want to go over the generalistic usage of an airbrush. I'll give you some tips and tricks, PSI levels, how to clean one, and I will go over some of the more or less desirable aspects of owning an airbrush, though I think a lot of these fall under this category, to be honest. First thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be going over the very basics for the newbies in the crowd, and I mean that endearingly. We all had to start somewhere. Now, the first thing you'll be doing with your brand new airbrush is you're going to want to get used to the overall action of the airbrush. Most likely, you're going to be using a dual action airbrush. This is undoubtedly the most common type of airbrush for miniature painters. In the most basic sense, what I mean is if we just simply push down on the trigger, nothing is going to flow through the airbrush. This will be dictated by how far back we pull the trigger itself. The other things you'll need, of course, are an airbrush compressor, an air hose, airbrush cleaner, thinner, and paper towels, gloves, and a mask. Everything that I use for airbrushing in terms of these essentials will be in the description. Now, I'm going to give you a basic rundown of the golden rules of airbrushing. Once you turn on your airbrush compressor with the airbrush attached, you're going to want to set your PSI level to around 20 to 25.
25 PSI.
In my opinion, 25 is the golden number for just about anything airbrush related. But we'll get more into the specifics later on. When loading your paint, you can either opt to mix this separately and pour it into the airbrush, or you can be like me and just mix it in the cup. Mixing it separately allows more control over the paint, and it makes sure that you won't clog the airbrush as often, but I ain't got time for that. Typically, I would recommend a 1:1 or 2:1 paint to thinner ratio depending on what paints you're using. If you watched other airbrushing videos, I'll sound like a broken record because I recommend you go for the consistency of skim milk. Now, like I said previously, you're probably going to be using a dual action airbrush. Just remember the basic rule: pressing down means airflow, pulling back means paint. Besides the distance, I would recommend that you do the exact same thing you do with a rattle can. Don't spray on one area too long because you don't want to let it pool, and I generally recommend anywhere from 2 to 5 inches of distance between the miniature and the airbrush, but this is dependent on what you're using it for. After doing so, congratulations, you've sprayed your first model. Now you gotta clean the airbrush. This part is not my favorite, I'll admit. But to start things out, I generally recommend anything from 2 to 4 drops of cleaner, and I would not flush it straight through the airbrush. What you'll want to do is utilize one of my favorite methods, the gangster gumbo. Love you, Kenny. In English, what I'm doing is I'm plugging up the nozzle of the airbrush using my hand, and I'll be pushing down on the trigger to allow the airflow to bubble up the mixture of paint and cleaner into the cup. After doing so, we'll be dunking the airbrush into a clean glass of water. This allows the paint/cleaning mixture to dissipate into the water, and once we've flushed out as much of the paint as we can then add a little bit more cleaner to flush out the airbrush. Honestly, sometimes I just flush it out using a little bit more flow improver and thinner on its own. It's probably best to use cleaner, but if you're in a pinch, I think this works just fine. Isopropyl is also pretty good for flushing out airbrushes, but if you're looking for a good deep cleaning of an airbrush, Tamiya Cleaner is the best, and it is literally identical to the Tamiya Thin Cement. I wish I was joking. These are the same product. I like having the little glass because it has the little brush thing. Speaking of deep cleaning, however, you're going to have to disassemble your airbrush if you want to do this properly. But I assure you, it's not nearly as scary as it seems. The biggest thing that you have to worry about is really flushing out the crud and making sure to carefully clean the needle. I found that pipe cleaners are kind of great for doing this, though you can always just get one that is dedicated for cleaning airbrushes. But now that I've given a rundown on the basic operations of an airbrush, I do want to go into a little bit more detail on tips and tricks for more specific methods in descending order of my personal experience. First thing we'll be going over is base coating and priming. I know I've been basically shouting it from the rooftops by this point in the video, but this is what I use my airbrush for the most. For starters, I recommend you thin your paint around 2:1 paint to thinner. Your paint texture should resemble skim milk, which is probably something I've heard in about a million airbrushing videos, but it holds true. For your PSI levels, I would go anywhere from 20 PSI to 35 PSI at the most. I would only go to 35 if I were priming. Base coating is a different story. And remember, not all air compressors are built the same, mind you. 35 may be greatly excessive to some airbrush compressors, but it all just depends on the manufacturer. However, more importantly, I would say between both base coating and priming, 25 PSI is kind of your golden number. It's not too light, it's not too aggressive, it's just about right. Now, something that you can do with base coating priming is zenithal priming. I did refer to this earlier, but if you're not familiar with what zenithal priming is, this is essentially spraying a model with a darker tone, usually black, and overspraying with a lighter tone, most likely white. This is to create a natural lighting effect over the model. You can do this with rattle cans too, of course, but there's no limits on colors when it comes to an airbrush. This actually ties into our next method: contrast inks and speed paints. These are a great way to really get the most out of a zenithal prime, like I stated earlier. You can even pull off some pretty easy undertones with them as well, and overall it's just really satisfying to apply. However, thinning these is very dependent on the paint. Typically, I recommend very little thinning, and your PSI level should range around 15 to 20 PSI. This gives you a lot more control over the paint, and going over these PSI levels can lead to a sputtering mess. One thing I will say, however, not all contrasts and speed paints are equal. Just like airbrush compressors, some paints will flow through the airbrush like an arrow, and others will make your airbrush do its best to imitate a coughing iPad baby. More often than not, contrast colors and especially inks work really well through airbrushes. Some speed paints work great, others don't, but when it comes to contrast colors and speed paints working well with airbrushes, often it's just because those are particularly good paints. Some paints just kind of stink, and there's no getting around that. This might be dated to say, but painting yellow is kind of a breeze with an airbrush. Only reason I'm saying it might be dated is I would argue that painting yellow is easier than ever because of paints like Imperial Fist and amalgamation of other contrasts and speed paints, but it's still easier with an airbrush. Now, the last thing that I want to go over is detail work, which, like I said, is the aspect I have the least experience in, but I guarantee you this will at least be helpful to you. For detail work such as adding in highlights and shading to models, you'll want to keep your PSI levels on your airbrush around the same as contrasts, roughly 12 to 20 PSI at the most. Like I said, having a lot less PSI means more control over the paint, so you'll want to thin your paint down to have more control over it alongside the PSI levels. This means we can afford to do multiple sprays if we want to without going overboard and ruining a model. Like with regular painting, the basic thing that you gotta remember is you gotta be patient. Even though this is designed to speed things along, with any detail work, you can't rush it. It's good to pick a light source when you're applying these kinds of details, and I do think it is important to kind of keep in mind to not go overboard like with shading. You can get kind of carried away doing things like this, trust me, I know. But again, it's just a matter of having discipline when it comes to painting in general. But now that I've kind of gone over the tips and tricks of the finer details of airbrushing, I want you to remember that I don't expect you to remember all of this. There's a lot of information for you to remember, but I'll give you a little breakdown of just about everything so you remember it in the most basic sense. Medium PSI, 25 to 35, skim milk thinning. Low PSI, more thinning. If you're sputtering, it's too thick. If you're spiderwebbing, it's too thin. Clean that airbrush after every paint, and do a deep cleaning after every 5 uses. But I do encourage you to come back and watch this video to remember the more finer details. But with all this info, you'll be good to go when starting your journey of airbrushing. And whether that be sticking to the basics or venturing out to do crazy Richard Gray level methods, these tips and tricks will stay relevant to you. And now I think it's about time I give you a look at the airbrush I currently use, and the sponsor of today's video. The Galeri Mobius 0.3 airbrush is honestly a pretty stellar model, especially those new to airbrushing. There's some really nice quality of life features like a detachable cup and an adjustable knob for restricting the trigger, and its engineering makes it really easy to clean. My previous airbrush on the channel has been an Iwata Revolution, which is a very high quality airbrush. It has some stellar precision for a 0.5 airbrush, and it's been a reliable little workhorse. However, the Mobius has been a direct upgrade so far. The Revolution has a fixed cup, which is more difficult to clean in my opinion, and another key difference is the price. The Iwata-Revolution comes in at 92 USD, and the Mobius comes in at 65 bucks. You plug in my discount code, it's 58.50. Easy for the creator to say that he likes the airbrush because he's getting paid for it, but in all honesty, I think that's a damn steal. I put this thing through the damn ringer before I decided to fully go ahead with being an affiliate. Let's be real, I'm a small creator, and it would be pretty damn devastating for me to promote a product that I actually think is poop from a butt. So if you're thinking of going after the Mobius 0.3, I genuinely believe you will not regret your purchase. Just want to say a huge thank you to Galeri themselves. It means a lot to become an affiliate, and overall, it just means that I get to do this more often and I can keep this up as a job. Things like this are what keep small channels alive, and I really do appreciate that. But I've definitely been flapping my beak enough for one video. If you found this video helpful, please make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kit bash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.